Okay, picking back up where we left off, we're going to talk about the physiology with male reproduction. So, before a boy is born, the placenta is going to secrete a type of hormone called the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, which we always just abbreviate as HCG. Ultimately, that's going to start the initial secretion of testosterone by the testes, even though they haven't decided to do the scrotum yet. Ultimately, before puberty, your GnRH, which is your gonadotropin releasing hormone, inhibits the small amount of testosterone that is secreted by the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands on the kidney do secrete a little bit of testosterone in boys and girls. However, GnRH is inhibited from reacting to that. However, at puberty, the pituitary part of the brain becomes a lot less sensitive to testosterone. So there's a lot more of the secretion of GnRH, leading to an increase in two types of hormones, your LH, which is your luteinizing hormone, and your FSH, which is your follicle stimulating hormone. Your follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for promoting sperm formation, so that spermatogenesis process we talked about. And then your LH, or luteinizing hormone, promotes those interstitial cells, which are surrounding the seminiferous tubules, to produce a lot more testosterone. Additionally, you do have a negative feedback hormone called inhibin, which is going to be secreted when there is enough sperm in the testes formed that we're going to inhibit your follicle stimulating hormone secretion. So in terms of the feedback loop overall, we have in the brain your GnRH, which is your gonadotropin releasing hormone. That will be released from the hypothalamus and go to the anterior pituitary. That is where your LH and your FSH reside. So that will stimulate the release of your LH, or your luteinizing hormone, and that will go to the interstitial cells of the testes, which are responsible for producing testosterone. That testosterone goes on to promote your primary sexual development and the secondary sexual development of males. Additionally, when there's too much testosterone in the system, that will act as a negative feedback, both on the pituitary, so no more LH and FSH will be produced, as well as on the hypothalamus, and that no more GnRH will be produced. Then your FSH, that follicle stimulating hormone, will also be released from the pituitary when we have a stimulatory effect from GnRH. That will go to your sustentacular cells within the seminiferous tubules, which will promote the process of sperm formation through spermatogenesis. Then you have the hormone inhibin, which when there's enough sperm formed, that will be released and go back to the anterior pituitary, cutting off your FSH. So no more of that will be released. So testosterone itself has a handful of effects on the male body. The bulk of it is going to come from those interstitial cells in the testes. But as I mentioned, some of it does come from the adrenal glands, and you actually do have even a little bit from your sustentacular cells within those seminiferous tubules. Your testosterone contributes to your primary sexual development and the secondary sexual development in males. The primary sexual development is going to be all the things that relate directly to the formation of the male genitalia, so the penis and the scrotum, all of the glands and ducts and structures, as well as the formation of sperm. Then all of the secondary sexual characteristics testosterone will contribute to are things like your hair growth all over the body, increased secretion of sebaceous glands, increased metabolic rate, bone growth, protein synthesis, the hypertrophy of the larynx. So that's when males typically have their voice deepened because that larynx gets a lot more thick. So all of those characteristics are secondary. They're not directly related to the sexual structures, but they are what make men more masculine. So testosterone, as I mentioned, is the key player for the male sexual development, and it's also the key for all the male sexual behavior. In order to maintain all of this with the ability of the reproductive structures to do what they need to have testosterone consistently. Then ultimately, the male sex act is just the general term that we give for all the things that happen resulting in the erection of the penis. So blood flowing to those tissues, the secretion of mucus into the urethra by that penile tissue, the buildup of semen in the prostate from all of those glands, and from the sperm released from the testes, and then the expulsion of the semen through ejaculation. Additionally, this also encompasses all of these sensations with orgasm, with ejaculation, and then with the refractory period after resolution. So now we're going to move on to the female reproductive system and a bunch of different structures that we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about your ovaries, or the ovaries that release the eggs, the uterine tubes that they are attached to, the eggs move down, the uterus, which is the major structure that is involved with developing a newborn or a new child or a new baby. The vagina, which is the major organ for receiving the penis. The external genital organs, so things like the labia minora, the labia majora, the clitoris, and then the mammary glands, which are responsible for producing milk. So to briefly highlight those structures, we have the ovary right here. There are two of them. We're just looking at one side through this cross section. Attached to the uterine tube. Then we have the uterus, which is the structure for developing a fetus. That leads into the cervix of the uterus and then the vagina. Then we have some of those external structures like your labia minora and your labia majora, as well as the clitoris. So starting with the first major structure, we have the ovaries. So the ovaries have a bunch of different structural components to them that are supporting them. And the major structure covering the ovaries is called the broad ligament. This is just an extension of the peritoneum, which is that serous membrane that covers the abdominal wall cavity. So most of the digestive system and some of your other structures are covered by one, if not both, of those serous membranes. So that covers the ovaries and as well as the uterine tubes that are attached. Then you have a couple different ligaments within the ovaries. You have a ligament called the mesovarium. This attaches to that posterior surface of the broad ligament. The broad ligament is basically a giant sheet covering all of the ovary and the uterine tube. Then you have your suspensory ligaments and your ovarian ligaments as well, which contain the arteries, veins, and nerves, contributing sensation and blood flow to those areas. So point those out. Broad ligament is this giant sheet that's covering the ovary and then the uterine tube and leads into the uterus. The mesovarium is not on this diagram, but the best approximation I can give you is that up here we have a cross section with the broad ligament and the ovary and the uterine tube. That mesovarium would attach to the posterior side. So if this side was posterior and this was anterior, it would attach at this point. Then you have your suspensory ligament and then your ovarian ligament. Again, those have the blood vessels and the nervous tissue within them. All right, so now we're on to the actual ovary itself. And the ovary has a couple of layers on the outside. So you have a peritoneal layer, that's the visceral peritoneum right on top of the ovary. That's referred to as the ovarian or the germinal epithelium. So that's just this series of cells. They're all lining the ovary itself. Then you have the structure called the tunica albuginea. This is the exact same structure we saw in the testes. This is just a very thick sheet of fibrous connective tissue. So that just runs all along the outer portion, but beneath the ovarian epithelium. Then we have these structures in the ovary itself. So we have a cortex, which is an outer layer. And then we have a medulla, which is an inner layer. Same as we saw with the kidney, that cortex being outside, medulla being inside. Pretty universal terms. And then we have the actual tissue that makes up the ovary, and that's called the stroma. So the connective tissue that just makes up the ovary itself is the stroma. So the process by which the ovary produces egg cells is called oogenesis. So oogenesis is a type of gametogenesis, but for females. So oogenesis is going to produce oocytes, and then spermatogenesis, if you recall, produces sperm cells. So both types of gametogenesis. So oogenesis, producing what is called a secondary oocyte within the ovaries. The process is somewhat similar in terms of terms to sperm development, but we're going to call them, we have the oo prefix on them. So you have oogonia, which is your most precursor cell, and that's going to divide by mitosis into your primary oocyte. However, the thing to consider with the formation of the eggs is that you also consider the follicle. So the primary oocytes are going to be surrounded by a type of cell called the granulosa cell. All these cells are going to stack around the oocyte, and collectively the structure will then be called a primordial follicle. Then all the oocytes going to develop, and those granular cells surrounding that oocyte are going to enlarge, and that primordial follicle is going to become a primary follicle. Then that primary follicle will continue to develop into a secondary follicle, and then ultimately what's called a Graafian follicle, also referred to as a mature follicle. Then, before we have the process of ovulation occur, that primary oocyte within the follicle is going to undergo meiosis 1. So if you recall, meiosis 1 is a reduction division that's going to reduce the amount of chromosomes from diploid to haploid, so from twice the amount to half the amount. With that half amount, that cell is going to be called a secondary oocyte. And from meiosis 1, we're going to have 2 cells. So the secondary oocyte is one of the cells that's made from the primary oocyte. But the other cell is what's called a polar body. So the polar body has the other half of the chromosomes, but it doesn't have a lot of cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is unevenly divided, and most of it goes to the secondary oocyte, which is the potential egg that can be fertilized. However, we need the polar body to be formed in order for that chromosome number to be reduced by half. So when that secondary oocyte is then formed from the primary oocyte, we'll then have the process called ovulation. And that is when the secondary oocyte gets released from the ovary, it breaks out of the mature follicle. And that mature or Graafian follicle will become a structure that's called the corpus luteum. Now, depending on if there is fertilization or not, the corpus luteum will have different things happen to it. And fertilization is just when that sperm cell is going to penetrate the secondary oocyte that's been released from that Graafian follicle, and the nuclei of the sperm is going to fuse with the nuclei of the egg. So that haploid cell and that haploid cell are going to fuse and make a diploid cell, which will develop into an embryo and then a fetus. So the fertilized egg, or if fertilization occurs, they'll make a zygote. And with the corpus luteum, if we have fertilization, that corpus luteum is going to persist, and it's going to produce a hormone called progesterone, which is going to prepare the uterus to be implanted with the fertilized egg. If we don't have fertilization, that corpus luteum is going to become a structure called the corpus albicans, which is basically just a degraded corpus luteum because it doesn't need to be used since fertilization has not occurred. So I know that was a lot. We're going to run through all that with the diagram now. So prior to birth, a female is going to have those oogonia cells. And those oogonia cells are going to go through mitosis to produce your primary oocytes. And then they're going to basically stop at that point. Those primary oocytes will then be surrounded by your granulosa cells and become primordial follicles. From birth to puberty, that number of primary oocytes will be roughly 2 million. It's going to decrease to about 300,000. So a lot less eggs ultimately for the lifetime. Then we're going to have that primary oocyte, once puberty is hit, develop into a primary follicle. So those the egg is going to develop a lot more, and those granulosa cells are going to become a lot thicker and increase in size. Then that primary follicle is then going to develop into a secondary follicle. It's going to continue to increase in size, develop additional structures, so things like the fluid-filled vesicles as well as the theca layer, and then continue to develop into the mature or Graafian follicle. While this is going on, you're also going to have your secondary oocyte undergo the meiosis 1, reducing the chromosome number from diploid to haploid. So one secondary oocyte will be formed, and then a polar body will be formed holding the other half of the chromosomes. But the secondary oocyte is what can actually be fertilized. So once that all happens, we have the process of ovulation, where the secondary oocyte ruptures from the granulosa cells. Then we may or may not have fertilization, where the sperm cell will unite with the secondary oocyte and produce a zygote, reestablishing the haploid chromosome number to diploid. If that does happen, that corpus luteum that the secondary oocyte broke out of will be maintained to produce progesterone. If fertilization does not occur, that corpus luteum will degrade and become the corpus albicans. All right, so next we're going to move on to the uterine tubes. This is the structure that is directly attached to the ovaries. And the uterine tubes go by a couple different names. So they also can be called the fallopian tubes or the oviduct. Any of those structure names are appropriate. I'm just going to refer to them as the uterine tube though. With the uterine tubes, you have the broad ligament component attached to it that is called the mesophalanx. That's just the portion of the broad ligament that covers the uterine tube. Then you have a structure at the very edge of the uterine tube that is directly attached to the ovary called the fimbriae, and these extend off of a structure called the infundibulum. Then as you move down the uterine tube, you reach a portion of it called the ampulla, which is the widest part of the uterine tube, has the largest diameter. And the ampulla is where fertilization typically occurs. The uterine tubes are made up of 3 layers. Some of these will look familiar from the digestive unit. So the outer layer is the serosa. You have a middle muscular layer, and then you have an inner layer called the mucosa. So point those structures out. Here we have the ovary, and then we have the fimbriae, which are directly touching the ovary itself. These help sweep the eggs out into the uterine tube. We have this opening right here in which the fimbriae come off of. That's the infundibulum. Then as we move into the uterine tube, we have the widest portion referred to as the ampulla, again, where fertilization is going to occur. And that's going to lead all the way down into the uterus. Speaking of which, the uterus itself is composed of 4 different parts. So we have a body portion, we have the isthmus portion, we have the cervix, and the fundus. 3 ligaments associated with the uterus are the broad ligament, like I've mentioned a few times now, the round ligament, and the uterosacral ligament. So the broad ligament, again, has covered the ovary, the uterine tube, and the uterus as part of the peritoneal serous membrane. But for the round ligament, that is a ligament that moves from the uterus through that inguinal canal. So that is between the urinary bladder and the anterior portion of the abdominal wall, and that connects to the labia majora. Then you have the uterosacral ligament, and that just goes from the uterus to the sacrum of the spinal column. The uterus itself has 3 different layers. So the outermost layer is the perimetrium. This is a serous membrane. Middle layer, myometrium, is a smooth muscle layer. And the deepest layer is the endometrium. This is a mucous membrane layer. The endometrium then has 2 sublayers called the functional layer. This is the innermost layer, and this is what is actually shedded off during the menstrual cycle. Then you have the basal layer, which is deep to that. And at the start of the uterus, you have the cervix structure, which is this very tight, less contractile portion of the uterus that has the cervical canal, which is lined with mucus glands to assist in lubrication. Next, we have the vagina, and this is the major female organ for copulation. This is the structure that actually receives the penis during sexual intercourse. And the vagina itself is the basic is the birth canal during childbirth, and also allows for menstrual flow during the shedding of that endometrial lining. A couple structures within the vagina itself is you have a membrane called the hymen that's at the opening of the vagina. You have these muscular walls within the membrane lining of the vagina that ultimately break down into longitudinal columns and transverse rugae. These rugae structures allow the vagina basically to expand and retract during arousal in order to accommodate the penis. And then you have the fornix, which is just the superior portion that attaches to the cervix right before the uterus. So externally, now we're looking at the structures outside the vagina. Collectively, this is just referred to as the vulva. And there are a bunch of structures within the vulva itself. So you have the vestibule, which is just the space. It's not an actual structure. It's just the space that that houses other structures. You have the labia minora. These are basically these tissue folds that form borders around the vagina. You then have the clitoris at the top, which is an erectile structure. It has the same types of tissue as the penis, and that has the corpora cavernosa and the corpora spongiosa, which allow for blood to be engorged in, allowing for a female to have an erection, similarly to a male. And then you have the vaginal orifice, which is just the opening to the vagina. Then within the vestibule, you have a couple different glands. So you have the greater vestibular gland, the lesser vestibular gland, and the periurethral gland. Ultimately, these glands produce fluid to keep things moist and lubricated. Then you have another structure that is lateral to the labia minora, and that is the labia majora. And these are just rounded folds of skin on either side of the labia minora. Ultimately, they can produce or they have glands for producing sebum as well as sweat. And then you have, lastly, the mon pubis. So the labia the labia majora both run superior and they merge over the pubic symphysis. This is the piece of cartilage that holds the left and right pelvic bone together. Okay, so to point those structures out, we have your vestibule. This is just the space that houses a lot of the other structures, such as the labia minora, right here and here, the urethra opening for the urinary system, the vaginal opening to the vagina. Then you have the outer folds of skin, the labia majora, here and here. You have the clitoris, which is that erectile structure. And the clitoris has a piece of tissue over it called the prepuce. This is also called the clitoral hood. And then lastly, you have the area where the labia majora on both sides runs superior to the mons pubis. This is the top of that piece of cartilage, again, that houses or connects the left and right pelvic bone. Then you have the perineum, and this is similarly divided into the anterior urogenital triangle and the posterior anal triangle, just like males. So with the anterior urogenital triangle, that starts from the mon pubis and then runs to the ischial tuberosity of the pelvic bones. So that houses the vagina and the urinary system. Then you have your anal triangle, which runs from the ischial tuberosity on those pelvic bones to the coccyx, which includes the anus. Then specific to females, you have a structure called the clinical perineum. This is just the piece of tissue that runs between the vagina and the anus. This is important to mention because during childbirth, there can be enough stress on the system that this piece of skin can actually tear. And there has to be a procedure called an episiotomy, which is where there's an incision made in that clinical perineum to assist with childbirth, to allow less stress to be on that system and create a wider opening for the birth canal. Then we have the mammary glands, and these are all about producing milk for the newborn to support postpartum. The mammary glands themselves are housed within the female breast, which are supported by what are called Cooper ligaments. These are the same thing as suspensory ligaments, so they're just holding the breast up in place. The breast itself is largely just composed of adipose tissue, so you see all these adipose yellow cells that I'm running my mouse over. Within all that adipose tissue, you have these lobes, and these lobes are then subdivided into lobules. So lobes and lobules, then those lobes have individual structures called alveoli. Again, these are very similar to how the lungs operate in terms of the alveoli structure. So the alveoli sacs have these ducts that then lead into what are called myoepithelial cells. And these myoepithelial cells ultimately expel the milk into the ducts to ultimately make way to the nipple to be released.